For today's video, we continue with the Kure wrecks, with the last of the well-known ships, because the Japanese cruiser Oyodo is a bit of a weird one, both in her design and her overall service. A light cruiser that was designed primarily to command submarines. Hence the otherwise odd choice of a massive hangar and no guns on the stern. Of course, this didn't happen. Oyodo only entered service in mid-1943, by which point her stated role was unnecessary. Instead, the Japanese would mostly use her for transport or escort duty, in addition to converting her hangar space for use as a command ship. That was, as it turned out, her much more famous role, operating as the flagship and headquarters of the combined fleet. Because of this, Oyodo was only involved in a couple combat operations, the most notable of which being the Battle of Cape Ngannou, where she took Admiral Ozawa aboard as Zuikaku sank, and after that came the bombardment of Mindoro in December of 1944. However, her service history is not the topic of today's video. This one will be focusing on her wreck. If you're interested in Oyodo's full story, I have a video on that topic that I'll link in the description. For now, I'll cover her sinking and then move to the wreck. After the actions off the Philippines, Oyodo returned to Japan. This would see her arrive back home on February 20th, 1945. As it turned out, Oyodo would never leave again. Instead, the cruiser would be moored in Kure on March 1st, 1945, where on March 19th, the first major American air raid arrived. And here, Oyodo's luck would finally run out. 3 500-pound bombs slammed into the cruiser, coupled with multiple near misses. The first bomb hit the port engine room, starting a massive fire. The second hit the base of her funnel, and the third hit the starboard side before exploding inside the cruiser. The combination of these hits and the near misses caused a heavy list. They did not, however, sink the ship, at least not entirely. Instead, Oyodo had to be beached, where the cruiser was patched up enough to be refloated, and then put in dry dock on March 23rd. While this would fix the hull damage, 4 boilers and much of her anti-aircraft battery just couldn't be replaced. The Japanese didn't have the resources by this point of the war. Nonetheless, the refit was concluded on May 4th. Unfortunately for Oyodo, this did little good. She remained in port, heavily camouflaged, as with the other ships. However, that camouflage would not save her when another American air raid came on July 24th. This saw Yodo hit by 5 500-pound bombs, which caused a list to starboard, and a fire that took 2 days to finally put out completely, only for a follow-up raid on July 28th to seal her fate. Oyodo was hit once again, and this time, the damage was too severe to handle. She capsized to starboard and was left in place. To add insult to injury, an American aircraft put 2 rockets into the capsized ship later that day. Between the 2 attacks, 223 of her crew were lost and 180 were injured. As for the ship herself, Oyodo was left in place. The hulk was only salvaged on September 20th, 1947. Where the cruiser was brought upright and towed into a dry dock, and then scrapped in place between January and August of 1948. Unlike most of these ships, I do actually have a couple images of that process, but we'll get to those later. First, let's look at the wreck left in place after the final American aircraft departed the area. Beginning here from the air, we have 3 pictures from the same general angle, with each one changing the view slightly. The first one here seems to be the one closest to her sinking, judging from the very notable oil slick all around the wreck. This is visible in the other two pictures, but not to this extent. The oil stretches out from Oyodo's stern, of course, but there's also some clear leakage around the bridge and the other superstructure. It outlines it quite clearly. Considering the general fuel situation for Japan, I'm almost surprised the ship had that much aboard. As for the wreck itself, there's not much to say. We have a good look at how shallow she is. Only the tip of the bow is underwater, with the rest of the hull still above the surface, albeit on its side. You can also see one of the turrets on the bow, and the remnants of her hangar as well, with the most recognizable parts being the bridge here, along with one of these shafts here, and finally the bilge keel amidships. Otherwise, not much to say. The next picture, for its part, moves much closer in. It looks to be taken around the same time, but it's hard to say for sure. Either way, this picture is a good look from closer in. The shaft and bilge keel are easier to make out. The same goes for the bridge tower and the remnants of the hangar. While the bridge is mostly intact, the hangar looks wrecked, at least as little as we can see of it. Unfortunately, the bow turrets remain mostly underwater. We won't really be seeing those until we reach the salvage. That said, let's look at the last of these aerial photos now. This is the furthest out of the bunch, but no less interesting for that. The oil slick is visible again, for example. It's far less clear though, so this might be further along. Or it might just be the angle of the image. Of course, the oil slick is probably the least interesting part here. This one does three things of major note. First, it neatly shows the shape of Oyodo's bow. The angle is very clear here. Second, it shows another view of the bridge. Not really a detailed one, but it's still a look from a different angle. And finally, this picture also shows how close to shore the wreck is. Not quite as close as Aoba was, but still quite close. The water here also seems to be shallower, judging from how much of the ship is above water, although that could just be low tide. And there's one more thing to note before we move on. It seems there are visible bomb craters on the land next to the cruiser, a sign of just how heavily bombed this area really was. With that covered, we can now move to the next set of three images. These will be taken from the waterline instead of from the air, starting here with a look at the submerged part of the hull. It does start a trend with these three pictures of not showing much in the way of detail. Much of the ship is underwater here. Regardless, there's still a couple details. The remains of the hangar here being one of them. It looks mostly intact from this angle, at least the part above water. Next to it, you can also see the two gun tubs. Those would have held the twin 100mm secondary battery. However, those are missing. They might have been damaged and removed after the March 19th raid. I doubt they were removed after the sinking, although that is certainly possible. No matter the case, they're gone here. Beyond that, the rest of the wreck is underwater. There's a mast sticking up halfway above the surface here, and you can also see the side of the hull, but not much else beyond that. That doesn't really get better in the next picture. This looks from the stern forward, with only two things worth noting. First, another look at the hangar, which does seem more intact from the water level than it did from the air. And second, the stern itself, which shows no signs of major damage. There are no visible bomb holes, although again, a good chunk is under the surface, and the part above water is limited to the deck in this image. Something the next one fixes somewhat by moving to the other side. Here we can see the shaft and prop from the aerial pictures. It's in one piece, as is the bilge keel and the hull around them, aside from what looks like one of the rocket strikes here, and a building, presumably part of the early salvage operation, mounted on the side of the ship. In any event, that wraps up this set. The next pair of images move even closer as they're taken from aboard the ship. First, we have this one. This looks to be taken from on top of the hangar, which has a broken porthole and some branches lashed to the side. That would have been part of the camouflage. Not that it helped much, looking at the twisted metal poking out from the water. Then again, aside from that debris, the ship doesn't look terrible. Yes, most of it is underwater, but the bridge doesn't show major damage. Even the fire control equipment is still in place. Although the gun tubs are empty here as well, with no sign of any weaponry. Just more branches lashed to the side. The next image, meanwhile, doesn't show much else. You've got a couple curious occupation troops standing on the capsized hull, and a clear water line here, which is probably the tide line. While this look gives us a better glimpse at the bridge tower and hangar, there's not much new here. The actual damage is fairly minimal outside of the broken metal, and the superstructure to the stern looks mostly fine. Even the branches and the mast are still in place. So with that done, let's wrap things up with the salvage. There will be 3 pictures here, although I also found a booklet with more apparent pictures of the salvage, which I'll link in the description for those interested. As for the pictures I'll use, we'll start here. This is after Oyodo was refloated and towed to dock to be scrapped. The image is unfortunately too blurry to really make out much detail. We can see the bow turrets at least, including what looks like the waterline from when she was sunk. The bridge tower, meanwhile, is in more or less one piece. Much of the extra equipment and platforms were stripped off during the raising, but the tower itself is there. The hangar is too out of focus to say. I can't make out if it's there or how much was removed. As for the second picture, this shows the turrets and the bridge closer in, which further demonstrates that waterline, the much darker color on the forward turret compared to its lighter roof. The bridge tower, for its part, looks about the same as the other looks we've gotten. And once again, the hangar is out of frame. Which brings us to the last image. Oyodo as of April 27th, 1948. All of the superstructure has been cut away, and the ship is well along her way to being scrapped. A sad sight if you like Japanese warships, but an interesting one nonetheless, because relatively few images have survived of the post-war scrappings. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.